So I just want to thank Lance and the organising committee for inviting me to talk. There's been some really amazing speakers and I'm quite honoured to be able to speak alongside them. So I'd like to talk about using waterbird information to demonstrate wetland importance. And I guess the focus I'd like to take is how we generate and actually use data from waterbird monitoring. So I'm not going to focus necessarily specifically on Ramsar, but it's all relevant to Ramsar. And I want to look at it in terms of how we do that nationally and then how we do that internationally. And I'd like to thank Dylan and Andrea for giving half my talk for me, so I might be able to skip over some bits. So I can certainly skip over those first 3 points there. I think we all know why wetlands are important. Particularly in terms of those ecosystem services for people as well as the biodiversity they support. And how do we actually determine importance for wetlands? So typically, as we've seen, by observations and measurements, key components of wetland systems to determine some sort of state, ecological state. And then from a biodiversity perspective, we're looking at things like vegetation communities, fauna, flora, diversity, condition, etc., etc. So, of course, my interest here is looking at waterbirds as a key component of wetland fauna. So they're a key indicator of wetland ecological character, which is why they feature so widely in so many of the agreements and the legislation we use. But why is that? So waterbird life histories are tied to the wetlands state and condition. And there's many species for which some or all of their life cycle relies on wetlands. But there's the other side to that, which is that waterbirds actually important parts of ecosystem function. So waterbirds aren't just a recipient of wetland condition, it's a reciprocal relationship there. And so as a consequence, we've got international conservation instruments or agreements or tools that draw on waterbird information for assessment. And we've heard all about the Ramsar Convention today. Waterbirds are foundational to 2 of those criteria under the Ramsar Convention. They're an important part of the migratory bird agreements. We haven't spoken about those at all today. So those are agreements between national governments which place obligations on those governments to protect shared species. So the first one of those was the Japan-Australia Migratory Bird Agreement, and one of the main species from my perspective as a waterbird shorebird person listed under that was the Latham snipe. And in fact, that agreement was instrumental in closing the season on hunting in Victoria, in fact nationally, and that hunting season of snipe has never been reopened. So that was very successful in its implementation. And then there's other agreements as well, like CMS and its related initiatives like the Flyway Partnership. And so the important point I want to make here is that all these different agreements, or in the case of our national legislation, they're all using quantitative data on waterbird abundance to determine or estimate population sizes and trends. Also, breeding is an important metric, but I'm not going to talk about breeding because that doesn't appear as often in these assessments. So if we look at the EPBC Act, again, I don't really think I need to talk a lot about this, except just to say that there are matters of national environment significance listed under the Act. And so we know that there are species that are listed in their own right, and those species listings match the IUCN criteria, which you can see up on the right here. I'm sure you're all very familiar with the IUCN criteria. The important point to make about the Act is that it treats subspecies the same as species, which is actually different to how it's done at an international level. So there's no differentiation between subspecies when we're looking at matters of national environmental significance. And then the IUCN Red List categories and criteria rely on that population abundance information. So if we have a look here, we've got the 5 criteria: population reduction, restricted geographic range, small population size and decline, small or restricted populations, and extinction probability. Most of these rely on abundance information and trends information. So if we go back to waterbirds, Australia has 135 species of waterbird, unless there's been some more splits recently. I can't keep track of them. 50 of those are shorebirds, and that includes migratory and non-migratory species. And all of those are under pressure from water extraction, land use change, climate change. And the waterbirds, I mean, we all know waterbirds, they're a really iconic group of animals in this country because they're so tied to our boom and bust conditions. And they're notable for their very mobile behaviours, their unpredictable movement patterns, which is quite different to Northern Hemisphere waterbirds, which often have very strict movement patterns or migration cycles. And then amongst the waterbirds, we have our shorebirds, and the migratory shorebirds are different in that they do have those very strict migration patterns. But these migrations take them across the globe, and that presents a whole bunch of new challenges for conservation and management because you're not just working with one national government anymore, you might be working with many national governments. And so this image here, this shows the East Asian Australasian flyway, which we've heard mentioned. In case anyone hadn't already picked it up, a flyway is a grouping of migration routes by multiple species. And so this image just depicts the variation in those migration routes between the breeding grounds of these species, which is the yellow, right up into the high Arctic here, Siberia, Chukotka and across to Alaska. So a lot of birds that breed in Alaska come to Australia, and then others go down the American flyways. And then we have the non-breeding grounds here in the blue at the bottom, and Australia is the what we call the terminus site for a large number of species. And many of these species migrate through the LOC, which is essentially a bottleneck on their migration. And so the East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership is a mechanism for trying to coordinate conservation and management monitoring across the flyway. And there are many organisations and partners, including the Australian Government, and a number of Australian NGOs are partners to that. So just a quick look at the EAFP. So they have their flyway site network, which is intended to designate sites based on these importance criteria and for the conservation of these migrators. So this is not just shorebirds, this is all migratory waterbirds here. So there's 152 sites across the flyway, 25 of those in Australia. They have 1,000 sites that are internationally important for migratory waterbirds. And excuse me, the important thing is that they use the Ramsar criteria for those flyway site designations. Excuse me. So where does the data come from? So at the national level, probably the longest running source of shorebird data, I'm just talking shorebirds here at this point, is the Australian Shorebird Monitoring Program. So that actually began in 1981 by the Australasian Water Studies Group. It was the population monitoring program back then, but the Tasmanians actually started monitoring back in the 50s and 60s. There was a bit of a gap in there. So we've got many decades worth of continuous monitoring across a large number of sites in Australia. And then, of course, the Richard Kingsford and UNSW run the aerial surveys, which is the basin scale surveys, which is great for monitoring waterbirds. It's good for monitoring shorebirds in terms of size classes, but they can't identify individual species. So we do have to fall back on the shorebird program for that. And then there's a range of other shorter term surveys. So I'm running a project on the Latham snipe here in that picture there. That's been going for about 8 years now, trying to address knowledge gaps about that species. So there's those kinds of survey information out there, or ad hoc or unstructured surveys or one-offs that we also draw that information when we can get it to supplement the national programs. And then at the flyway level, there's the Asian Waterbird Census, and that's a really important source of information. It's probably the only continuous, consistent source of information we get for the flyway. And the important point with most of these programs is that they're almost entirely collected by volunteers, often supported by professionals. So what I want to do is I want to talk a bit about how we use these data at the national level, and then I want to have a bit of a talk about the international or the flyway scale usage of data. So if we go back to the Act and we go back to matters of national environmental significance, so we've got individual species that are listed as matters, so threatened species, but we also have migratory shorebirds listed as a group in their own right. And so there's 37 species of migratory shorebird that are listed as a matter of national environmental significance. And the significant impact guidelines for development relate back to the abundance thresholds that Ramsar uses. So the 1% for international importance and the and 0.1% for national importance. That's how we assess those. We assess sites based on those. So you can see that everything comes back to having that waterbird abundance data. And the waterbird abundance data is used to generate population estimate revisions, which are there to guide those significant impact guidelines. And there's been 4 major revisions in Australia. The Watkins was the first one, which actually looked at waterbird species as well. The Bamford et al. Was the big one that was used for a long time. And then in 2016, I led a team to update those population estimates because, well, I'll get to why we did that. I mean, they need to be done anyway periodically because populations change. And then just recently, Lena Van Swinderen and Rich Fuller with BirdLife Australia have just completed a new revision that's not yet finalised and released for public comment yet. Oh, I'm just going to go for public comment, for the public viewing. So just to talk about the one we did in 2016, so the Bamford estimates from 2008 were actually based on quite old data by that point. So we had data going right back to the 1980s. One of the things that didn't do is it didn't try and account for areas that are not counted. So we didn't have any information for a lot of areas in the flyway. And since those estimates were done, we've had a massive increase in the amount of data that's available to do this. And that's just been through the Shorebirds 2020 program, which was the previous iteration of the National Shorebird Monitoring Program. That had a huge amount of engagement activity that went with it. We had more people collecting data, and we've just got much greater volumes of data now than we had available to those earlier estimates. And at the same time, we had a whole bunch of species declining. And this figure in the middle here is from the Colin Studd's paper back in 2017, I think it was, showing that the decline of a whole range of migratory shorebird species based on data in Australia, and those that migrate through the LSC were declining faster than those that don't. So that was the impetus to revise the population estimates. So we used 3 sources of data to do that. We used what was called the Shorebirds 2020 program. We used the Ornithological Society of New Zealand Wader survey, so that started in 1983, and then we also had access to the Asian Waterbird census, which started in 1987. We conducted the analyses on a 5-year period up to 2016, and the interesting thing with those data sets is that the coverage in those data sets is the best for Australian coastal regions. So we've really got the most continuous count coverage in the coastal areas in Australia, but there's a whole bunch of areas that we were lacking very good information. So inland Australia and the Gulf of Carpentaria, in fact Northern Australia, there were some big gaps there. Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, we really didn't have much data there at all, and some information missing from in that Yellow Sea region. So we had a good data set to work with, but there were still gaps there. So what did we do? So we basically categorised species into major groupings. So we had those species that are predominantly coastal and marine, and they're the ones that are picked up the best in the surveys. We had those that are inland, wetland and grassland species, so they're not often picked up very well in coastal surveys, and they're using these, well in Australia, these boom and bust habitats, but also elsewhere in the flyway. And then we had a handful of species which are not well represented in this flyway at all. So for example, the wandering tattler here, it breeds up here in Alaska, and some come to Australia, but the majority of that species migrates through the American flyway. So in the case of these species, we actually used other estimates to generate those, often the American estimates. For those coastal marine species, we used a process of spatial extrapolation of modelled abundance. So what we were trying to do was estimate the number of birds that we're missing in surveys, because we knew we're missing a lot. Even from places like the Gulf of Carpentaria, we knew we were missing large populations there. And when the project was finished, I think they really expanded some efforts in the Gulf and have picked up a lot of birds there. We did an expert review to adjust that, because the numbers can differ depending, just because you've modelled habitat and extrapolated across it doesn't mean that birds are uniformly distributed, of course. So we had an expert review process in that. And then for the species that were not coastal marine species, we used data, we made an estimate based on the breeding grounds. So if I just show you a couple of examples. So the spatial extrapolation, we sourced or modelled intertidal area mapping. So we actually already had it for Australia, but we didn't have it for overseas. And then we overlaid shorebird count areas. So in Australia, that's really great. We've got polygons representing all the shorebird areas, but elsewhere in the flyway, they don't have any of that information. So we buffered their point count areas, and we calculated the proportion of overlap, and then adjusted our modelled coastal population estimates by an extrapolation factor. And so, for example, eastern Indonesia was one of the ones with the poorest coverage. Only 2% of that coastline is covered. So that had a much higher extrapolation factor than others, some of the other better counted areas. And then for those that we didn't have very good coastal count information, we used the breeding ground information. So we got the breeding ground maps from BirdLife International. We adjusted those to be more appropriate for certain species. So in this case, the little ringed plover, you know, the breeding grounds were just this big blob, but they actually breed in these drainage lines and wetlands, so that it was clipped by the waterways and wetlands features. And then we classified species as low, moderate or high density breeders. And then we modelled a relationship between the breeding density and the population size based on well-counted species, and used that to generate predicted abundances for these species that are not well counted on the non-breeding grounds. And that process was applied to 19 species. So basically what we got is we got two sets of estimates. We got spatially extrapolated estimates, we got breeding ground and density estimates, and then depending on these the distribution of them, coastal or inland, we would pick those estimates out. And then there was a few that had their own, as I said, like from other flyways. Last year they repeated that. They used exactly the same method. They used period data from the 10 years between 2012 and 2021. The spatial extrapolation process was applied to all the new count data, and the breeding ground approach was just used as is, because the project was smaller in scope, so they couldn't repeat it at the same scale that we did it the first time. And they came up with fairly similar population estimates. So there was about 3.7 million individuals based on spatial extrapolation. We had about 4, so the numbers are kind of similar. The interesting thing I found out of this was the knowledge gaps they identified were pretty much identical to the ones we identified in the previous one, and that is we still don't have very good handle on what's happening in inland Australia and northern Australia. We really need to get better at understanding what's happening in Indonesia and PNG. We just don't really know much about shorebird populations there at all. They still haven't got shorebird areas mapped in the rest of the flyway, which is a really high priority, and I think it's something the partnership's looking at. And it's interesting that, you know, with these issues above, then the modelling techniques that we were using they just can't accommodate some of these problems. So we really do need to address some of these data gaps before we can apply better modelling techniques, which of course always get better and better. So outside of Australia, Wetlands International coordinates and updates the waterbird population estimates. That's what the Australian governments use for their own assessment purposes. The waterbird population estimates is generated at a subspecies level. So again, just reminding you that's different to the EPBC Act, which is at the species level. And the World Wildlife Fund funded a project led by Jessie Conklin back in 2014, where they used that information to prioritise species and sites for conservation action in the flyway, and this was in recognition of the massive loss of habitat in the Yellow Sea through intertidal reclamation. That is not a problem that has gone away, although fortunately has slowed down a little bit. And then in our flyway, the EAFP has recently coordinated a conservation status review, and all these things are underpinning the identification and prioritisation of the populations and the sites needed to support conservation of shorebirds. So I just want to talk a bit about the conservation status review, and I'd like to thank my colleague Tej Mankur at Wetlands International, who led this project and shared some of this information with me so I could present it to you today. So this has only just been finished. It's the first time it's been attempted, and it came out of one of the key result areas identified in the strategic plan, which is the conservation status reviews for waterbird populations are periodically produced to set and adapt priorities for action. and it called for use of the Waterbird population estimates process. So they've got a particular way in which they go about generating population sizes and trends, and they use this to derive the population thresholds for the flyway site network designation. And so the EAFP was calling for the development of this conservation status review of migratory waterbird populations and its regular update. I think they've got some really ambitious update timelines. I think it was like every 2 years or something. I think this took 2 years to do, so it might not be quite that frequent. But a really important piece of work that was done by Tasia's team. So just a bit of an overview of the information they had in there. So that they were looking at all waterbird species. There's 216 waterbird species in the flyway and 276 biogeographic populations, so a lot of those will be subspecies as well as the species. And of those, we've got 76 populations of 60 shorebird species, the biggest ones, of course, being the Charadriidae, the plovers, and the Scolopacidae, the sandpipers. So the way Waterbird population estimates does their estimation is usually to provide a range. So they've got a range of a total population size of 8 to 16 million. It's a pretty big range. But this is the reason why, because the population estimates vary greatly in quality. So we've really only got a very small number, and it says 12% are based on census information. Where the census information isn't good enough, so the abundance data isn't good enough, then they have to bring in expert opinion. And where that's not good enough, then they've got to make a guess. And in some cases, they have no estimate. So we've got a lot of uncertainty in there in terms of the information to do this estimation. So the most abundant shorebirds, so these are ones that exceed 500,000, 500,000 birds. A few species that do occur in Australia, black-winged stilt, pin-tailed snipe, and of course oriental pratt-and-cole listed there. You can see there's a bit of a range in terms of the estimate quality. We've got a few census-based ones like Dunlin, which are probably fairly well covered in the Northern Hemisphere. And oriental pratt-and-cole, interestingly, this oriental pratt-and-cole estimate hasn't changed since 2004 when we counted 2.88 million pratt-and-cole from aircraft along 80 Mile Beach in Northwest Australia. That's still one could argue that's probably out of date now, but we just don't have the information for that species because it's very boom and busty, you know, they just disappear for years at a time. And then if we look at the species that are the least abundant, so under 10,000 birds, I've got a mix here, so grey plover, bar-tailed godwit occur in Australia, rough is fairly rare, are very well known spoon-billed sandpiper and spotted greenshank are some of our rarest waders in the world. And here we see that we've lots of guesses going on here to generate some of these estimates, and really not very good data about trends. So that just makes it if you think about those IUCN categories that rely on population estimates and trends, it's very difficult to know what's going on with some of these species. So yeah, if we dig into the trends, only 8 populations, 10% have good trends, while 70% of the population have poor or no idea. So despite all this work that's going on and all this monitoring, we've still got a lot of gaps in our knowledge, and a lot of it's about capacity building in difficult to get to places or places that don't have the resourcing to do the surveys. So we have, here's a lot of species for which we don't know the trend. We've still got lots of species that are declining and very few that are stable or increasing, so that the story's not improving greatly. But then we see this big variation in trend quality. I mean, we've only got 10%. Here's the 10% that we've got good trend information, and then all this uncertainty here around trends. So here's an example of one of the species that was part of the review. That's the bar-tailed godwit. That's a very common species in Australia. That's one of our coastal species. There's 3 subspecies recognised in our flyway. So we've got bowerii, which breeds in Alaska, and large populations of bowerii actually migrate to New Zealand. They've got quite a big population of bar-tailed godwit in New Zealand. Mensbieri is the one that it breeds at the top of Kamchatka, up in Chukotka Peninsula there. They're the ones we get in, particularly in Northwest Australia. And then Anadorensis, which is very well known. I don't know much about that subspecies. And so we've got pretty good information about the 2, bowerii and Mensbieri, from census-based stuff. We really don't know much about that 3rd subspecies, and that's reflected in the trends. Both of these are declining. We don't know what's going on with the 3rd subspecies. That's probably also declining. And bar-tailed godwit's one of the ones that's been subjected to 1 minute Wow, better skip past global flyway network tracking of godwit. Skip past all these sadly endangered species. And just quickly point out that the CSR has got among their recommendations is to develop a comprehensive flyway monitoring program and to establish the partnerships and do the engagement to try and support that program. So just my last two slides, what are the knowledge gaps that we see emerging constantly is about the lack of data. We hear this all the time, and it is true a lot of the time, that there's a lot of wetland sites, species and even regions, so we think Indonesia, for which we lack sufficient data to make these assessments. But we also have data in Australia that could be better used. So it's not always about missing data, it's often about how well you use those data. And one of the things I think is seriously lacking yet, and this is at the Ramsar level as well as the flyway site network level and within the country, is a lack of network-based approaches. So, these are mobile fauna we're talking about here. They don't use just one wetland, but site-based assessments don't pick that up. They don't pick up those interdependencies between wetland ecosystems. And these are things we need to think about with the EPBC Act review. We're going to see this regional planning approach that's going to be based on data. How do we prioritise areas for protection? And that's going to be based on the quality of the data we have available. And how well is it going to pick up this concept of cumulative impacts? Ecosystem function measures like food web-based approaches, probably something that really needs to be picked up in the future. And of course we have the expansion of GPS tracking of birds, which is it's going to be hugely powerful for trying to understand about distribution, subspecies and trends. And of course, link sites. Thank you, sorry I went over time.
We're going to do swapsies lands?
Yeah.
Yeah, having that one.
Yep.
Do I have time for questions? Do I have to sit
Yeah,
down?
no, you've got time for a question, yep. Any questions? No.
Yeah, got one.
I've got a question for you. So I think the clear message that comes through from a lot of this really great work is that the biggest challenge is then when you're doing these site-based assessments as well is to work out, well, what number then is that 1% of the total population estimate, right? So do you know how we deal with that uncertainty given we don't have great estimates for some of these species? How do we decide then what that 1% is?
Well, I mean, the 1% set by the population estimates, and that's why the population estimates are updated regularly, because we do a population estimation and we come up with a size and we set the 1%, and then the species declines or it increases or its distribution changes or we get more data and then we have to reset it again. So it's a really important part of setting those criterion is that regular update. Some people get nervous with updates because when populations decline, the 1% drops. Or when populations increase, the 1% goes up. And people don't like it when that happens because their site that was once protected is no longer protected. And that's another issue altogether.